Most pilots don't seem to realize that VFR on a very dark night, over water or sparsely populated rural areas, is really IFR.
Despite recommendations from FSS and ATC, at the end of the day, the final decision is up to the pilots.
The controller told him he would be flying into a low IFR conditions at Muscle Shoals, and she offered to file an IFR flight plan for him. She knew they were on a VFR flight plan, but from the way the pilot handled himself on the radio, she assumed that he was either an instrument-rated pilot or he had at least quite a bit of instrument training.
Most of what I remember about the accident was that it was the darkest night I'd ever seen in my life.
It was an average February afternoon when Adam Lerner, age 47, and Joy Franklin, age 33, planned a VFR flight from Memphis, Tennessee to Huntsville, Alabama. They were flying a Rockwell 114TC single-engine land plane. They headed out to the plane, started the engine, taxied out to the holding bay, and began their run-up. During the run-up, the engine spewed out a series of nasty pops when Adam tested the right magneto. So they taxied back to the ramp for a quick fix, except the fix wasn't so quick because it was Sunday and the maintenance shop was short-staffed. Adam was angry at everyone, and cooling his heels was only part of the problem. Besides a must-attend meeting in the morning, with this new delay, Adam would be making this flight all at night, a dark night, and Adam hadn't flown at night in several months. He was uncomfortable about night flying in a single-engine airplane. Adam was nervous, especially after his plane had just blown a mag.
Why don't you sit down and take a breather? They're gonna fix the plane.
Look, I get that it's a Sunday, but I don't understand why it's low staff. Like, we need to get going. Oh my God. And it's gonna be dark soon. We have to go.
I get it, but there's nothing we can really do.
Unfortunately, the plane is not going to be ready in time, so why don't you go to the restaurant just to kill some time? I'm very sorry about that.
What do you say?
I'd say let's do it.
Sure, let's go.
Alright.
One eternity later.
Adam and Joy returned to the FBO's lounge at 7:20, and finally at 7:40, the plane was ready to roll, so Adam made his habitual call to flight service.
FIC, this is Paul speaking.
Hey Paul, I want to file a VFR flight plan.
Okay, what's your route today?
So I'm going to Memphis to Huntsville in a Rockwell 114TC. Registration Foxtrot, November, Whiskey, Papa. I'm going at 2,000 feet. Total time en route is 1 hour 15. And there's 2 people on board.
Okay, great. Would you like any weather or no times today?
Yeah, give me a full weather brief from Memphis to Huntsville.
Okay, well, at both Memphis and Huntsville, we're reporting marginal VFR conditions, and there's a possible IMC on your route today.
Perfect. I'll go anyways.
Okay. Have a good flight.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Although in between Memphis and Huntsville could be a problem, Adam had more than 25 hours of IFR under his belt and wasn't worried about a little scud running or cheating now and then. Plus, he had Joy along for moral support. They were definitely going to Huntsville. Adam and Joy headed out, and Adam checked the mags 3 times during his run-up and dialed in the Muscle Shoals VOR. They climbed to 2,000 feet, staying below the cloud bases. They knew it would take around 40 minutes to reach the Muscle Shoals VOR, since it was 120 miles away and they were at such a low altitude. The air was smooth, and Adam was pleased for Joy's sake, because she wasn't thrilled about flying. After Memphis Departure Control turned them over to Memphis Center, Adam confirmed their heading to Muscle Shoals that was suggested by the controller. So far, so good. However, 30 miles west of Muscle Shoals, everything was not so good. The visibility dropped, and Adam was pushed down to 1,500 feet due to the bases of the clouds. With an MEA of 3,000 feet, Adam was getting uncomfortable. It was more difficult to see the lights of the small towns on the ground. He decided to call Memphis Center, who had been giving flight following.
Center, wonder if you have any power-ups for our vicinity. The ceiling seems to be getting lower. We're at 1.4 and having trouble staying clear of it.
Sorry, not many VFRs out there tonight. If you'd like to follow IFR, we can get you up to a better altitude so you wouldn't have to work so hard.
Thanks, but we're doing fine right here. Can you give us the current weather for Huntsville?
Sure can. What we have is almost 40 minutes old, but they're still calling for marginal VFR. Ceilings are running 1,200 to 1,500 with visibilities at 4 to 6 miles. Winds are northerly at 8 knots, and altimeter has been steady at 29.81 inches. Temperature is 40 and dew point is 38. That's been pretty steady too. You'll be able to get an update on that when you call Huntsville Approach about 20 miles.
Anything on Muscle Shoals?
Yes, sir. They're IFR, and they have been for the past couple of hours. The ceilings are running about 400 feet with 2.5 mile viz. That's a little worse than the last reading, and the barometer is 29.77 inches and falling. If you'd like, sir, you can try Huntsville Approach now on 125.6. You're a little far out now, but you may be able to reach them.
Alright, I'll call Huntsville Approach on 125.6. Thanks for your help. Good night.
Good night. When they connected with Huntsville Approach, the controller gave them even more emphatic warnings. He also knew the pilot was lying, and as much told him so. You know, we're limited in our authorities in what we can tell a pilot. We can't come right out and say, you're risking your life, you're a danger to everyone, and you ought to get down, and now. I'm sure it would make us controllers feel better to be able to do that, but I doubt it would make much difference or wouldn't be good for air safety as well. We'd end up having shouting and swearing matches with some of those determined machos who are up there.
Approach, this is Rockwell. We're at 1.3, squawking 1,200, about 40 west, landing Huntsville.
Roger. Squawk 4244 and ident, please. Huntsville altimeter is 2980 inches and steady. Ceiling is 1,100 over 3.5 in fog and haze. We had a pyre-up a few minutes ago that the tops of some of the hills were being obscured and that the higher terrain areas in your vicinity may be IFR already. If you'd like an approach, sir, it will be 36 ILS. You can climb to 2.8 and turn right heading 130. That will give you the marker with couple miles to spare. Your radar contact 37 miles west of Huntsville International. Say your intentions, please.
Yeah, we'll be fine at 1.3, but we're turning right 130 degrees. Would appreciate vectors all the way in, and we'd like to expedite. We had a mechanical back at Memphis. That made us very late.
Understand you are remaining at 1.3 and turning 130. Are you landing at Huntsville International, sir?
That's a firm, Rockwell. This is landing at Huntsville International.
Okay. Stay on the 130 heading, maintain VFR, and climb to 1.5. That's 1,500 feet. You're in a high terrain area, sir.
Okay. Climbing to 1.5. Say again the altimeter, sir.
2980 and steady. Please say your present altitude.
We're just leaving 1.3, climbing to 1.5. That's 1,500, sir.
Had climbed less than 50 feet before he lost all ground contact. Quickly reversing the climb, they descended all the way to 1150 feet, before Joy and Adam finally saw some lights below. Ahead was pitch black, just an empty void in the relentlessly dark night. A minute later, they were back in the overcast and descending. At 1050 feet, more lights on Joy's side of the airplane. Ahead, still the same, nothing. They leveled off at 1050 feet and the controller noticed their altitude. Anyways, the approach controller did as much as he could, short of a confrontation. When the pilot climbed back up to 1500 feet and stayed there for a while, apparently not having too much trouble, the controller probably figured they were alright. At least he hoped so. But he was ready to give them an assist or vectors or an approach, and he kept hinting around it. That's another thing we can't do, is force a VFR pilot to accept vectors for an ILS. Even though that was effectively what was happening, the pilot could have told the controller to keep his vectors and just head straight to the airport. But the pilot didn't do that, which led to the controller to believe that they were working together, that the pilot was flying safely, taking the vectors, and heading for what should have been an easy approach into a well-lit airport in VFR conditions.
Rockwell, your altitude readout is 1.1. Please say your altitude immediately.
We're having some problems staying completely clear of the overcast, but it seems to be okay now. We're level 100 and VFR.
You'll have to climb to 1,500 feet to stay legal VFR. The minimum en route altitude in your vicinity is 3,000 feet. That means there are obstructions at 1,000 feet, and you'll have to stay at least 500 feet above them. If you can't do that, we'll have to declare you an emergency and bring you down at the nearest airport.
Okay, we're climbing back to 1.5. I'll let you know if we're having any problem remaining VFR. It's just very dark out here, and we can't be really sure how much forward visibility we have.
Stay on your present heading. You're 22 miles from the airport. No reported traffic. Maintain VFR and report reaching 1.5.
Rockwell, Roger.
That's when the controller started giving me such a hard time. He wanted me up into the stuff, and I wasn't about to stay up there, as queasy as I was. So I told him what he wanted to hear, hoping he'd buy it and leave us alone. I even thought about turning off the transponder and telling him I was having trouble with it. But I didn't bother because I knew it was VFR at Huntsville, and we'd be there in 15 minutes or so anyways.
Adam acknowledged the controller's instructions and climbed to 1,500 feet. They were in total IMC at 1,100, and he was struggling to fly straight and level. After 5 minutes, Adam had enough, and without warning, descended to 1,000 feet, where he began to see lights. After that, he edged back up to 1,100 feet. He called approach and reported his altitude, adding that they were in good VFR. It was only a half-truth, but he didn't want another confrontation with the controller. I'll never figure out who these pilots think they're fooling when they call in these phony altitudes. Our Mode C readouts, they aren't perfect, but they're never really off by anything more like 500 feet. You wonder why they'd risk their lives doing that. Hell, we don't care if they scud running.
In this case, the lies were compounded by the Mode C transponder that was reporting the airplane's altitude. The controller saw that the airplane was low from the reading on the scope, but he was being told by the pilot that the actual altitude was different. Because the airplane was flying so low, the controller knew that its transponder signal could be unreliable due to the hilly terrain it was flying in. So he didn't know who or what to believe, and in those kinds of situations, he has to go with the pilot.
Brushing the clouds, Adam descended to 950 feet. Still no lights. The controller saw Adam's altitude readout and panicked, but he couldn't get a long-winded inbound to clear the frequency. Another aircraft called in as Adam descended below 900 feet. After an agonizing 18 seconds, the controller advised all aircraft to stay clear of the frequency and called the Rockwell back. There was no reply. He waited 4 or 5 seconds and waited for the next sweep of the scope, but the signal was gone. The controller picked up the phone, dialed the emergency number, and waited for relief.
After we finished analyzing the tapes and putting the pieces of this puzzle together, we realized that the most critical item was the 18 or 20 seconds when the controller couldn't call the pilot. Had a climb been initiated only 10 seconds earlier, the airplane would have cleared the rising hill it crashed into. They may have lost it later on, and I say that because the pilot wasn't doing too well flying the airplane, but for sure they would have missed that slowly rising hill.
Adam and Joy heard only the first few words of the controller's call. It was interrupted by the crunch of the airplane as it collided with the slowly rising ground beneath them, careened forward, bouncing off the terrain. Joy's neck broke, and she died instantly. Adam, probably because he was holding on to the control wheel, was slammed forward against the panel with his head hitting the plastic windshield. He was knocked cold, seriously injured, but still alive as the Rockwell came to rest.
All of our senior people who have heard the tapes relating this accident have lived through similar experiences. When you put in 20 more years as an active controller, you really see and hear it all. One thing the tapes got plenty of notice in was the 20-second gap in communications. That's a pretty typical problem we sometimes run into because it's a party line system. Every once in a while, we can't get through to the airplane we need to talk to because of the clutter. Pilots talking too much or breaking in when they shouldn't. It isn't always a bad procedure or discourtesy or anything like that. There can be too many airplanes on the same frequency with legitimate needs to talk to the controller. It's just an old system, and it should have been upgraded a long time ago. Why it hasn't been is a mystery to me and to most of the people who I work with as well. But frankly, after living with it for so many years, most of us just don't give it much thought anymore.
It's hard to pin the communications gap on anyone. It was unusual for it to be that long, but in an antique system like the one ATC is stuck in, it happens now and then. You could call it incredibly bad luck that it happened right at that particular moment. But the way they were flying in those conditions and in that terrain, they were an accident waiting to happen. Another thing that's drawn a lot of flack from the surviving pilot was the way he felt he was being badgered by the controllers. We've heard the tapes and we don't buy any of that. Controllers can't see and feel the conditions an airplane is flying in. They have to rely on what they're told by the pilot. If the pilot doesn't tell the truth, it can confuse the situation and lead the controllers to give mixed signals and sometimes advice and instructions that contribute to an accident.
But I have to admit, in this case, the system added to the problem that the pilot was having. And if the controller had been able to get through to the pilot right away and tell him to pull up in a hurry, maybe the controller would have done so and saved their lives. But that's not a sure thing. Most of what the controller was told that the pilot had ignored anyway, especially when it came to altitude. The pilot was doing his own thing, so who knows? Maybe the bad luck led to the communication gap and made a difference. In my mind, and in the official position of ATC, it didn't. But it did put a spotlight on the glaring deficiency in the single-channel radio system we're living with. Maybe that'll do some good. It may help somebody decide to do something about it. Let's hope so. Let's hope it's soon.
The controller is trained that way. He's trained to accept the fact that the pilot is acting in his own best interest and won't do anything stupid enough to kill himself. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. Now, think about what an enormous difference the pilot's lying made. The Senate controller, who is a soft-speaking woman by the way, certainly never pressured him. She suspected he was scud running because of the weather at Muscle Shoals. It was fairly low IFR, but she couldn't know for sure what the pilot was flying in, or what he could actually see. She did the best she could by turning him over to Huntsville approach as soon as possible, rather than offering him a flight assist to a VFR airport. Remember, he said he was VFR and okay. An assist would have been easy, by the way, because there were 3 airports reporting flyable VFR within a few miles of where they were at the time. The approach controller then wound up inheriting the problem. Only it was much worse than he suspected because he wouldn't necessarily have known the weather at Muscle Shoals. He wasn't operating out of Memphis Center where they knew Muscle Shoals was IFR. So, he was stuck looking at his scope and listening to the pilot, getting 2 different altitude numbers, one of which was critical. The pilot and the controller went back and forth, with the pilot saying one thing but doing something else. And while that was going on, the frequency suddenly got busy with other traffic, and the controller found himself helpless to do anything about his lying pilot. Talk about lousy timing. with a long-winded, drawling talker to boot. It was really a weird set of circumstances. We asked the pilot about his recollections of what happened and got mostly gibberish. Either he was really confused or he wasn't ready to tell us the truth, but he did pretty much confirm that the controller's scope was giving accurate altitude readings within 100 feet or so. He also claimed that he had initiated a climb just before they hit the hill, but that isn't consistent with the investigators' reports. They believed the airplane was flying straight and level when it impacted because of the way they found the prop, the gear, and the separated wings. So again, two different stories, but for my money, I'll take the word of the professional investigators. Just one other issue warrants some comment. That's the question about the VFR flight plan that was filed by this pilot, and why both the center and approach controllers may have thought he was IFR qualified. First of all, he was out there on a very dark night in marginal, if not IFR conditions, and sounding like he knew he was doing. First of all, he was out there on a very dark night in marginal, if not IFR conditions, and sounding like he knew what he was doing. Not that either of those things should make any difference. He definitely should have been treated like a non-instrument rated VFR pilot. But if you'll take the time to listen to the tapes carefully, you'll agree that, from what he told the controllers, he couldn't know what to think. When he was offered IFR flight plans, he turned them down by saying he was VFR and didn't want to bother flying an IFR approach. He didn't say he was a VFR pilot, and he didn't say that he couldn't accept an IFR flight plan because he wasn't instrument rated. If I recall, he even had an explanation for declining that he had gotten off too late and was in a hurry. So what are controllers supposed to do? They're not mind readers, and they don't have anything that tells them what kind of pilots they're dealing with. They can only respond to what they're told and what they're asking for, and I believe they have the right to expect those pilots to take at least some of the responsibility for their own safety.
Under a hood was all gray. This was, for the most part, all black. Nothing, except occasional lights from towns and a few farmhouses. Other than that, it was unreal, like sitting in a dark room with only the panel lights on. If not for some light turbulence, it would have been like flying a simulator. When you think about it, I guess, it was really an IFR trip for most of the way. You see, that's what I don't understand about the FAA's position about whose fault it was. I made no secret about the fact that I was a VFR pilot on a VFR trip. There was a flight plan filed, controllers had to know that. But they kept asking me if I wanted to file an IFR approach, and I kept refusing them because I knew that I would be illegal. Also, I wasn't too sure I could handle it by myself, without approach plates or knowing anything about what the approach even looked like, or how many turns I'd have to make, or altitude changes. Besides, every time we lost ground contact, I had trouble flying the airplane. Probably because I realized I was on my own for the first time, and the person sitting right next to me was not an instructor. But whatever it was that was giving me a problem, I can tell you, it was very real to me. To the point where I was afraid that somewhere along the line I was going to lose it and going to spin. So I was determined to maintain some ground contact because I knew that the first thing I had to do was to fly the plane. And so here I am, with a torn up face that brings tears to my mother's eyes every time she sees me, and a body that won't let me work or do anything useful, and a feeling of blame and shame over what I did to Joy. She really deserved better, and I think I did too.
Will you remember me? Don't let your life pass you by.
Michael!